much. Thank you for agreeing to talk to me about this important topic.
It's a pleasure, Memory.
Thank you very much. So, my name is Marianne Roux. I'm based here in Zimbabwe. I'm an occupational psychologist. I've been in consulting for a very long time, including working for companies such as Ernst & Young, and I also did work in normal organizations outside consulting, but currently I'm a managing consultant of an organization called Industrial Psychology Consultants in Zimbabwe. So I've been running this organization for the past 15 years now.
Right, that's great.
Yes, so
wonderful.
Good. So maybe a brief background about yourself before we go into the questions, so that we don't waste too much of your time.
Yes, Memory. So I have 28 years experience, South African by birth, and also an organizational psychologist. About to finish my PhD in leadership, leadership in the 4th and 5th Industrial Revolution. So really looking at what does it take to lead in the new context of work. I have worked for Accenture, Price Waterhouse, Deloitte, and Mercer in my life, as well as run my own practice twice, and teaching at business schools as a professor of practice in executive development and MBAs. I've also been an HR director twice, once for Horace Food in Cape Town and once for Cricket Australia here in Australia, where I live right now. Okay,
good. Thank you very much for that. I've had some interviews with people from Australia as well, but it was on on productivity. During at the height of the COVID, 2020, I think around March 2020. Yeah, so very interesting. So if we can start, maybe you can start by defining for us, especially our listeners, the people who are going to watch this, what is leadership in the context of organizations? Is there a difference between leadership in the context of organizations or outside formal organizations? What is your view of leadership?
So Memory, I've been studying this I've been working in it for 28 years, but in my PhD, I reviewed everything that's ever been written about leadership and about leadership development for the last 5 years. I'm sure nothing else exists. If it does, I have not found it. And I can tell you what leadership is not. And that's really important to start with, because so many people still follow things that are not right. And the first thing leadership is not is a set of competencies. The second thing leadership is not is a hero leader that does everything by him or herself and saves everybody. The third thing it is definitely not is a set of traits and personality traits that you are born with. And I just see these myths absolutely everywhere. And in my research, after 5 years of really pulling it together, I kind of got to a definition, and it's a difficult definition, but I think leaders in the new world of work, or organizations or countries or not-for-profits, I work in all of them, or startups, they understand that organizations and countries are made up of humans, and they are really human-centered. They don't think about organizations and employees as machines, as systems and processes. They understand the complexity of human beings. And so they intentionally share power with people. They co-create things with people and get their input and use the brightest and smartest ideas from their people. And they collaborate with others and create ecosystems where people can really together respond to emergent challenges in a very agile way. So I also think they continuously develop and transform their own and others' abilities so that they have the right capability in the organization, in whatever capacity they work. And I also think that they are deeply ethical. And I think this is something we've had a huge crisis about. They are purpose-driven and values-driven and ethical, because that's where trust comes from. And if leaders are not trusted, they cannot be leaders. Of course, they can coerce people and force them to do things, but they will not get long-term commitment and extra effort. And finally, I think that they are resilient and they manage their energy. and they know that it's important that they and their people are well so that they can work well. That's really how I see leadership memory.
Thank you very much for such an explanation. It covers most of the things that I was going to ask, but I'll ask some of them anyway. Yes, you say the leadership is not about competencies. Maybe before I go there, let me just say, can are leaders born or they can be developed?
They can most definitely be developed.
Mm-hmm.
My caveat on that is that it takes 4 things to develop. And the first thing is people must make a choice to be a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if people have not made an intrinsic choice to be a leader, it'll be very hard for them to lead.
Mm-hmm.
And what they then have to do is learn the practices and mindsets of leaders, because there are sets of practices and mindsets. And finally, they then have to show up with courage, because it's not easy to be a good leader. So it can be developed, but it's not an easy development, and it's a lifelong commitment. You never stop learning and growing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You did talk about leadership not being competencies, but what we see in practice is that most organizations, when they want to develop leaders, they go through some competence profiling and then say go through a leadership development program. What has been your experience with that? Does that work?
It doesn't work. And what also doesn't work is 3 or 5 or short-term leadership immersions.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not how people learn, and this is not how people work. The things we get wrong is competencies change all the time, and all it is skills and knowledge. For example, things like leaders now need to know to be digitally literate, right? So for me, a competency is digital literacy, making sure that all our leaders are digitally literate. That's a competency. We still need that. But those things are going to change all the time. They need human-centered design skills, absolutely. But that is not what leadership is about. Leadership, if I think of the model that I drew up for my PhD and that David Day also has, leadership at the core fundamental is the purpose, values, and ethics of a leader. You cannot teach that to people if they're not willing to do the hard work of ethical reasoning and really thinking through. The second layer is adult development theory, which I find most HR and leadership practitioners do not understand at all, is how people make sense of the world. For example, if my ego is attached to being the smartest person in the room and being the expert, I'm never going to be a good leader. I need to learn over time, and it's a very long period of development, adult development, right? Which comes out of education. It's not a competency, it's a sense-making capability. We've got to help leaders on how to make sense, how to solve complex problems, how to dissolve them, how to co-create, how to look at multiple practices from people. It takes time. It's not a one-hit wonder, and it's not a set of competencies. Competencies is a very small part of this. And the next thing people went after competencies is they all went crazy with behaviors, right? So emotional intelligence and all those things. Behaviors and competencies for me is the top of the iceberg, right? It's the things that are easier to do. It's the things that you can teach. The things that are much harder to do is to change the way I make sense of the world and my ethics and values and the consistency that's required. And that's where real leadership sits. It sits in that difficult territory. Most people working in HR and organizational psychologists included like to work on the easy to see things and the easy to fix things. They are not willing to do the hard work of lifelong learning and commitment to learning for leaders and collective leaders, because leadership is done in a system of leaders. It's not an individual leader. The world is too complex for that. So it's a very functionalist approach, competencies and behaviors. It's long out of fashion. Leadership is a practice and a mindset combined with courage and choice.
Yeah, very, very interesting. You talked about being ethical, sense making. I'll go back to those issues. The first one is if ethics is at the center of leadership, can we develop ethical conduct within people? Can we train people to be ethical, or this is more personality linked?
It's not personality linked. What we can do is we can help them to understand their own values, the organization's values, and look at the alignment between those. That's critical, and really reflect on their own behaviors and give them feedback on whether they're consistent or not and whether those behaviors are showing up, right? We can do that. Doesn't mean they'll do it. because they still have to make that choice. But the second thing we can do, and I actually did a program at the International Leadership Association in Belgium that was run by the American Army, of all things, an ethical reasoning course. And they are ethical reasoning courses. And I find that very few leadership courses actually include ethical reasoning and moral maturity and ethical maturity in their courses, where leaders are really, really challenged. And, you know, we had to go through several scenarios where we had to play different roles, and we had to look at whether something is a moral dilemma or not, or whether it's a clear ethical choice. And if we don't start to develop those things in our leaders, we are never going to improve. But it starts at school. It does not start later in life. We have to develop leaders much, much earlier.
Okay, very interesting. You did talk about sense making. Can you give me more details on sense making? Is it something related to how smart someone is? What is it?
Not at all. Sense making is a skill of contextual intelligence and sense making. So it is really important. So whenever I develop leaders, I start with ethics. I start with personal agility practices and mindsets, and I start with sense making and contextual intelligence before I do anything else with them. For the first 6 months, that's all I work with. And what is really important about sense making is it's people who are not internally focused, but it's people who, leaders, make sense of the environment and complexity in the environment for their clients and for their people. That's what leaders do. In other words, they read, they listen, they learn, they watch the news, they read their economists, they find out what's happening in their industry. They find out what's happening politically, economically, socially, and they make sense of it with people. They think about, what does that mean for our industry? What does that mean for my people? What does that mean for the capabilities we have? That is what we mean by sense making. And it's critical that we do that for our people, because the world is changing so fast that we need to continually have sense making happening. And people become so internally focused. And you'll be surprised, Memory, how few people actually read. When I ask a set of leaders who just reads The Economist in the room, it's amazing. My father, who was a CEO, gave us all Economist to read every single week of our life, and the Time magazine. And we had to watch the news, and we had to read the newspaper, because he would be asking us questions about the world during lunch and dinner.
Now, that's a very interesting perspective, which I think I've also observed in a lot of senior leaders. They are clueless on a number of current issues or trending issues. Yeah, you go into a room and you raise something that you think is pertinent, even to their business. They have no idea what is happening.
Absolutely. And it's just horrifying, isn't it?
Yeah. You mentioned emotional intelligence in the context of leadership development. Can you give me more information on that?
You know, I've done, one of the programs I run is a program on personal agility, 6 practices and mindsets of personal agility. And, you know, when I started 28 years ago, I started with 7 Habits of Highly Effective People and had the opportunity to work with Stephen Covey, which was incredible. But, you know, those things happened 28 years ago.
I also had the opportunity to bring him
here.
Yeah.
Right. But that was 28 years ago. It was relevant for 28 years ago, before the 4th and 5th Industrial Revolution. Then emotional intelligence came in, and it was very relevant for the 90s and maybe even the early 2000s. But a lot of work has happened since then in terms of the brain that changes itself and how we can actually rewire our brains. And that's one of the key reasons I believe people can change their behavior and work on their values, Memory, is because the brain can change itself. We can rewire the brain and we can change our habits, right? And it's really important. I don't think emotional intelligence at that point was developed enough to understand brain theory, and it had not included things like growth mindset and grit and emotional agility, the kind of things you have to keep evolving your models. You cannot get stuck in models that are 10 or 15 or 20 years old. You have to keep looking at what is required in this context that is fast changing and extremely uncertain.
You also mentioned the issue of adult development and how probably people in doing leadership development are not utilizing this theory a lot. Can you give us more information and how you have used this in leadership development?
This is really important. I think one of our problems has been, I'm also a university professor, is that the faculties at university are so siloed, they never talk to each other. And what we really need to do is we need to bring psychology, education, social, anthropology, philosophy, all these things together, because what we really need is a transdisciplinary approach to leadership, right? And adult development comes out of education. And Bob Keegan, probably the most important writer on adult development, Robert Keegan from Harvard, said that we always thought that people's brains developed until they were about 18, 21 years old, and then it stopped. And then we learned this is not true. People keep evolving and keep learning if they expose themselves to things and if they keep working a certain way. And that's what adult development is, right? So there's kind of soft adult development and hard adult development. Soft adult development is what we call ego theory. And ego theory is very interesting. And we measure people. And what we see is that 60% of leaders are what we call socialized minds. They are people who either are diplomats, so they don't like conflict. So remember, you'll see these people as I'm speaking. They don't like conflict as leaders, so they just avoid it completely because they just want everyone to get along. Then we have also in the socialized mind, the expert, who wants to know everything and all the micro detail. And that's why they're not sense making, because they're so busy micromanaging, right? Yeah. And they want to be the expert. They don't understand that they mustn't be the expert. The people are the experts, or people who go into overachievement or overdriven. Those are the three socialized mindsets. And the thing with those mindsets is it's all about what others think of me, right? And comparing myself. Leaders that can really lead in the future are what Bob Keegan calls self-authoring mindsets, right? So I understand my view, I understand others' view, I have capacity to work with all of that. I'm willing to change my mind when something no longer fits, no matter how much I hung on to that picture, that model, whatever it is, that strategy, I understand. So individualists do that, and then people become strategists. And this is very hard work to do. You really need developmental coaching. We also have 7 reflective analytical skills that we teach people to become systems thinkers. You become a systems thinker, not a linear thinker, right? So you start to solve complex problems using complex problem solving, not linear analytical problem solving. So that's the hard theory. The soft theory. The hard theory is the 7 reflective analytical skills I spoke to you about. Yeah. That is absolutely where we've learned what does it take for leaders to go from being very linear to very systemic in their thinking, which we know is required in a more complex world, right? A more human as technology takes over world. So this theory, this development, I'm trained in both. I'm trained in Suzanne Cook-Reuter's work, and I'm a coach in her work in soft ego development. And I'm also trained in Theo Dawson's work called Lectica with a C, Lectica, which is the 7 reflective analytical skills. And I use this to assess people before we appoint them in senior roles. I also assess personal agility. I want to know that they're curious. I want to know they've got growth mindsets. I want to know they've got grit. And I want to know that they are systems thinkers. I'm less concerned about what expertise or knowledge they bring. Of course, I want some, but I know they'll learn. But those things are much more critical for me in leaders that really lead well than the other things.
Yes, you did talk about coaching. How effective has been coaching in your experience in terms of developing leaders?
I think there's a lot of nonsense coaching out there. I think when it's done well as part of a larger organization transformation and leadership development program, and the coaches are all aligned and on the same page, then it works well. It does not work well when every second person becomes a coach and has their own coach, and the coach has their own method.
That's what is happening across.
I know, and they pay a fortune for these people. Yes. And they get no impact whatsoever. Memory, I've got to tell you this. I got the opportunity to meet the most amazing human being, and he was my father's professor at Stanford, Professor Jeffrey Pfeffer. He wrote a book called Leadership
I follow him
BS.
All the time.
Yes, right? Time. Leadership BS. I got the opportunity, Memory, to have a glass of wine with him a couple of years ago here in Melbourne. So he is really, really amazing human. He said to me, Marianne, you would not let a surgeon operate on you that doesn't have a significant qualification, years of experience, and a set of knowledge that's accredited by somebody. And yet every single person can be a coach or a leadership developer or develop a leadership model. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, even some people who have never been in leadership are coaches.
Absolutely. They do a 2-week course online, and then they throw themselves out there as a coach.
Yeah. Very interesting there. Another thing that I wanted to ask you is, I was reading somewhere where they were talking about leaders derailing, basically failing, even if they're intelligent.
Oh yeah. There's so much derailment.
Yes, derailment. If you can talk briefly to us about the issue of derailment.
Yeah, I also work with an amazing guy called Bob Anderson, and we do the Leadership Circle 360, and it's also connected to Robert Keegan's work. The kind of things that derail leaders, and one of the things, by the way, in leadership development is you should also teach leaders what leadership is not, and also about the dark triad, about narcissism, about psychopathic behavior. You should teach them about, derailment, because we always tell them what good leadership looks like, but we never tell them what bad leadership looks like. And it's really important that they know and can understand whether they're doing these things. But in Bob Anderson's model and Keegan's model, basically below the line behaviors that mostly derail leaders, and it's critical. I use 360s regularly to work this out with leaders, and I give them that feedback, is they either try and control things, or they try and protect themselves or their interests, or they are very complying. It's not just controlling, it's also people who comply. So the ones who want to control, they are the ones who are authoritarian, they are really ambitious and political, and they're perfectionistic, right? And so they really micromanage people and they drive them crazy. That derails leaders. I've seen it over and over again. The ones that defend, they are arrogant, they know more than others, they can be very elusive from people, very withdrawn from their people, they cannot connect to people, and relationships is critical in leadership. Or they can be extremely critical. So they're this constant critical voice or naysayer. And the third person is the person who wants to be liked and wants to follow the rules and does not like conflict, right? And that all those things derail leaders. And I see evidence of that every single day.
Yeah, very, very interesting there. So given all this derailment, and the potential for development, can these things be corrected? I'm coming to this in the context of you were saying there are certain things when you're teaching leaders, you have to highlight what is not leadership or what does not constitute leadership. And related to that, are there some people also who should never be in a leadership role in the context of development?
Absolutely. I think there's a difference for me between leaders who are controlling, protecting, and complying, and we can give them that feedback in the 360s, and we can coach and work with them. And we can also make that part of their key performance areas that we expect them to improve, right? So we can work with that. I have successfully worked with many leaders like that. The ones that are much harder to fix are the ones from the dark triad, where there are actually personality issues like narcissism, right? And sociopaths and psychopaths. And for me, way too many of them get to the top of organizations and really destroy people, and they bully others and they play politics. For me, those people should never be in leadership roles. And we should be really clear when we do our succession planning that we don't go for what we call brilliant jerks, people who are high performing, all those things, and we excuse their behavior all the time, but they're sexist, they're racist, they bully people. That should never, ever, ever be allowed in an organization. Never.
That's very interesting. So one of the discussion that I've had with people on social media is the issue of someone goes to do an MBA, and the organization or the board then thinks, oh no, this person is now a leader. What is your take on education, the level of education and leadership?
The MBA, I teach MBAs, and I say to the MBAs, please don't expect to be anything. If you are not different when you walk out of here, I have not done my job, right? I don't want you to pump a whole lot of knowledge and phrases in your head so that you can now go and throw all the latest buzzwords out at people and look like you know something about everything. You need to be a changed individual. So my job, if an MBA is good, it can do a lot for a leader. Yeah. But there are so many bad MBAs. It's also a lot of money making in MBA land that absolutely does not challenge an individual as to who they are and what kind of leader they are. What do I think about education? I've met many leaders who've had absolutely no education whatsoever, especially when I was at Woolworths. I remember one of my tellers in one of the food stores having a conversation with her and finding out that she was running a church of 2,000 people in her community and going overseas for international conferences every year, right? And the organization never looked at her for a leadership role because she was, you know, she had a standard 8. And for me, she was an exceptional leader. So I said, no, we need to do something with you. And we developed her. I think we overlook things. I think doing a degree, a basic degree, is a good thing. I think lots of skills, ongoing skills development is a good thing. I think having done an MBA or master's degree 10 years ago is a problem because your knowledge doesn't last more than 2.5 to 5 years. Yeah. So if you do not keep yourself up to date, I'm much more interested in what practices, skills, mindsets leaders bring and what evidence they show me of personal agility, ethics, courage, right? The willingness to step forward, willingness to lead change. I'm much more interested in that than the qualifications. Or as my dad always said when he was a CEO, he's not interested in people he doesn't want to know you've got 28 years experience. He wants to know what you did. Because if you had 28 years of the same, he's not interested.
Yeah. So in terms of developing leadership in an organization, if someone was then to ask and say, how do we develop a strategy for leadership development in a small or big organization? Is there a strategy like that? Or is there a certain approach to leadership
there
development?
Is.
Well, sometimes I just see people say we've got 10 senior managers, they must go for this leadership development.
Yeah. Exactly. And the providers make lots of money. So they convince them that that's what they need and that their program is the 3-day wonder that you've always been waiting for in your life on Nero or on, whatever. No, basically part of my leadership PhD was not just to develop the model for leadership, but also a model for an integrated leadership development that actually works in the future of work. And that's about to be published in an academic journal. But basically, the components of the model is that you co-create lifelong journeys with your leaders. You go to your leaders, just like you do employee experience. You go to your leaders. I spent time with McKinsey India where they gave me leaders at every single level, and I worked with them through what capabilities, mindsets, and practices they felt leaders needed at every level. So I gave them some thought leadership. And then I spoke to them specifically about what they felt from that and from their own experience as leaders in the Indian culture they felt they needed. We did some empathy mapping of how they want to experience the journey, and we co-created their leadership journeys with them, 3-year leadership journeys at every level of leadership. That is how you do it. That's how you get buy-in. That's how you get the design right for the context. So you start there. Your participants should never be the leaders only at the top. You should find ways of developing all leaders at every levels and really early on, and also collectively, not individually. The methods that you should use should be a blended method of digital, social, experiential, and reflective learning, so that people can learn everywhere, anywhere, in sizable, biteable chunks. And it should be designed, the learning itself should be really based on adult development theory. So you need to be sure you build in certain core models at the back, like personal agility, like contextual intelligence. It has to be based on that. The content, interdisciplinary, as I said, and the facilitators, I think we have very bad facilitators out there. So they need to understand transformative learning. And they also need to understand performance support, because the learning doesn't actually happen in the course. If you read Gottfredson's work, he says the learning happens when the person for the first time uses that skill. So imagine I've learned how to do constructive conversations. That's great, Marianne. You've taught me now. I've role modeled that, but I'm only going to have my first difficult conversation 2 or 4 weeks from when I've done the learning. That's when I actually learn. So what performance support is there for me then? Can I phone a coach and discuss it with them? Is there a clip I can watch? So a lot of what we do now has to be very different in terms of all the learning tools that we use. And then finally, you've got to track and evaluate your results in real time and adjust your program. Most of my programs now evolve as we go. We have a plan. We start with a plan, which we've co-created. And then as we go through, together with the participants and assessing using Kirkpatrick's 4 levels, we continue to adapt it and evolve the program. Because you can't come with, there is no one-size-fits-all program. Nobody can tell me that there's a one-size-fits-all program. The contexts are too different and it's changing too fast and there's too much new information coming out. So we need, it's lifelong, it continuously evolves, it's all leaders, it's blended. You really need to get a proper integrated leadership development model.
Yeah. Yeah, as we get to the end of this, you did talk about what I would say is training decay. If you go for a leadership development training program, you never have an opportunity to practice. It disappears basically within a few months.
Absolutely, we waste so much money.
Yeah. So what can organizations do to address this issue? That's number one. And the last question is, how do we know how effective the training has been, given the amount of money that is being spent by these organizations?
I think the first thing is that you throw out everything you have. Just stop, and have a really good look at what leadership is in the 4th and 5th industrial revolution and in your industry, and assess whether you are basing it on what leadership is. Are you basing your leadership on the right approach? Throw out the competency models, throw out your current development programs, just throw it out. And then co-create with your people a model that works for your organization, your industry, and co-create a development program that works for your model and your industry, and then start to design from there. And just start over and start to read. I'm very happy, Memory, if people want to follow me on LinkedIn, I post on this all the time. So they can follow me on LinkedIn. Okay. And also just connect with me if they want to know more. But my first paper is in a book called Maturing Leadership. That's about leadership. And the next one will be coming up quite soon. I will let you know what that academic journal is that the model is, leadership development model will be in. But just throw it out and start again. And curate content. You don't have to develop it. There's amazing content. Once you know what your leadership looks like, there's amazing content all over the world, lots of it free, that you can actually access for the ongoing learning and upskilling of your people.
That's correct. Okay.
In terms of how you assess it, sorry, Memory, in terms of how you assess it, I look at actual results. I look at business results. I look at sales, profit, promotions, retention, performance, right? Obviously, I measure real-time feedback on programs and adjust it, but ultimately over 18 to 24 months, I always look at real business results and whether we've been able to shift it.
That's excellent. Well, that's what I also look at. Most of the time, I see a lot of companies wasting money, and sometimes you let them and say, look, this is really not in the context of your business. It's not going to give you any value.
Exactly.
But because obviously the people providing the training, they convince them and they go ahead and get nothing out of it. So in closing, Marianne, what would you say to any organization that want to develop leadership?
Look, first of all, forget the competencies. I think you've got to start with recruitment, and who are you promoting and who you're recruiting into leadership roles? Are they human? Are they collaborative? Do they have a growth mindset? I think you've got to look at really carefully who you recruit and promote. And then you've got to reward performance and behavior and impact. So do you reward people for collaboration? Do you reward them for psychological safety? And then you can get them in ongoing development, fix leadership development, and start really early with all your leaders. And fourth, and most important, get rid of toxic and poor leaders and create space for these new leaders to emerge.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marianne. I think we have covered most of the issue that I wanted us to cover. So what is going to happen is that we'll obviously clean up this recording and post it on our blog. We'll give you the link, and maybe in the interim, if you can have Amanda send me whatever profile you want me to put on that link.
Okay,
About
I'll do that now.
and also all your social media links so that people can also follow you. We'll promote it. Once it's out, we'll start promoting it, and we'll be tagging you in those promotions as well.